last several years since my PhD, I've been researching participatory governance, participatory democracy. I'm interested in deliberative democracy as well, but also co-production and participatory research. And I think what I'm focusing on going forward is bridge the gap between participatory democracy and participatory research, because somehow these two fields have remained separate. And even if we talk a lot about participatory democracy, the way we research participatory democracy is not very participatory. And so it's actually good to enable participants to self-evaluate their own experience of participation and also their perceived social impact. So I'm really interested in exploring this space and bridging these gaps.
Perfect. Thank you. So you are the leader of Inspire, European project,
Yeah.
about intersectional space of participation, inclusive, resilient, and embedded. Can you explain briefly
What it is about?
Exactly.
So I should say I'm the scientific coordinator, and I'm co-coordinating with Brigitte Gissel from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And I don't describe myself as a leader. It's a fantastic consortium with a lot of expertise and passion about participatory democracy from different perspectives. And so I think it's more a case of distributed leadership and working together towards making the practice and also the discourse and the research on participatory democracy more intersectionally inclusive. And I think there are a few big problems that we identify with how we study and think about and do participatory deliberative democracy at the moment. First of all, it's often decoupled from the political economy of participation. And we know that socioeconomic constraints really affect participation and people's capability to participate in an equal way, right? And because the field has always focused on politics and political arena and sort of forgot about the political economy in which these spaces are embedded, we think that's one of the reasons why participatory democracy doesn't really have the impact on social justice and equity that we would have expected, right? So we really want to focus on that. Then we also think that the practice of participatory democracy has always been, the way we design these spaces has always been very top-down. And it's often designed by people in academia or the democratic sector. Now, a lot of these people come from a particular narrow demographic group. We are part of this narrow democratic group, right? White and middle class. And because of that, we feel that these participatory spaces often universalize the experience and the expectations about participation of this narrow demographic. And that's one of the reasons why we struggle to involve people from other groups that are most of them marginalized in all aspects of public life, and they don't trust the state with a reason very often, right? So ethnic communities, young people, and so participatory democracy is not really helping to bridge the gap between these groups and state institutions, right? So we think, okay, how we can then involve these groups? What about co-designing these spaces with them so that we rethink participation from their perspective? And this means also experimenting with different approaches, not just the deliberation and rational argumentation and all, talk-centric in an assembly, which might not suit certain demographics like young people, right? And so we want to make it fun because we know that democracy is really relational and it's about empathy. And so we're trying to experiment more with arts-based approaches and like the legislative theatre. I could tell you a lot more about legislative theatre, but I know you were also with Katie Rubin, and she's the real expert, right? And then The third aspect is that we really want to also do a lot of co-production and involve policymakers in this space from the very start, because a lot of democratic innovations practice stops at the point of recommendations, right? And there is not really much thinking about what happens after the project. So we want to really embed these processes in the local context, the policy context, and the civil society context. So we don't have this. We want to have these spaces in vacuums, where there is these participatory events that very few people know about, right? Instead, we want to really involve, build on grassroots action, right, and see what the community needs support with to make their participation more inclusive, for instance, and then embed it in what they're doing to really make sure that this participatory work continues to happen beyond the project, right, and can perhaps generate a more participatory culture within the civil society, but also within policy institutions. And so that's why we want to have this open-ended dialogue with civil society groups and policymakers around these spaces to think about how we can just engender more participatory ways to do things in the long term, with the perspective of the marginalized group at the center, right? And we were talking before about ancestry representation or sampling, but it's really about we think that if we start from the perspective of those that are rarely included, these spaces are more likely to be inclusive for everyone, right?
If I understand well, the project understands the participation as a process.
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Yeah, exactly that. Instead of having an event, a participatory event like a citizen assembly, we want to engender a participatory process that can continue and that consider not just the participatory agenda setting, and so generating policy ideas from the perspective of citizens, particularly those marginalized groups, but also participatory scrutiny, so an open-ended dialogue between participants, civil society, and policymakers to check on implementation, because implementation is a black box, and we're quite naive to think, okay, we've got this recommendation, these policymakers committed to them, it's going to happen. It doesn't work like that, because policymaking is very complicated, and a lot of decisions happen at implementation stage, right? And so it's a bit of a black box, and there's all this regulatory framework that are often in conflict with participation. And so one of the aims of having a more embedded process is also to democratize public administration, right? So by having this open-ended dialogue that can hopefully generate more participatory way of doing policy making, we can think about how to navigate these barriers together through ongoing co-production between the citizen and civil society and the policymakers. So that's what we want. That is not just an add-on. You have all your representative structures and all your political economy, and then add-on spaces of participation that obviously is going to have limited impact, right? It happens, and then social capital disperses quickly because it's not organized. Citizens that participate, and then no one checks on what happens next because there's no one to monitor it. So you have to rely on the policymakers to get back to you. But that doesn't happen not because policymakers are bad people necessarily, but because, policy environments change and political pressure change. So you also need to, if you want to think about participation as a process, you also have to think about ways of bridging the gap between participatory spaces and campaigning, for instance, or grassroots and social movements, and create some public support for these participatory spaces, because at the moment very few people in the general population are aware that they even exist, right? So it's we want to really ground the space in the real world rather than, because it's self-indulgent otherwise. We have these super fancy participatory processes, but then they're not really changing anything.
I understand. I understand. Yeah, I think maybe to include all of this diversity, you talk about the intersectional lens.
Yeah.
No, maybe we should put this lens, to understand better the reality in
Yeah.
applying to participation. What is it? Can you define this
I
intersectional
am
lens?
not the expert in the intersectionality. I think there are colleagues in our consortium, like Rasa, Diazono, that have a better understanding of the theory, but we feel that oppression is always intersectional, right? And we always have multiple identity. Even talking about vulnerable groups is unfair and disempowering because no one is vulnerable all of the time, but everyone is vulnerable some of the time, right? And I think we want to engage with these groups that experience intersectional oppression to understand better the sort of intersections of this oppression. It's often socioeconomic background, right? But also intersects with different gender identities and racial identities and ethnic groups. And so I think by having very diverse groups across different spaces and experimenting with different approaches, we really also want to enable participants to self-define their own identity as they participate and sort of to create space for processes of conscientization, right? And Paulo Freire talked about this, and building a collective action, not just within groups, but across groups, because I think we don't want to essentialize people and just brand and label them with one identity, right? So the young people that I've been working with in Manchester and that are coming here next week, we engage them as young people, but they're all very different from different ethnic groups. Some are LGBTQs, and so their experience of like in that case we talk about youth mental health, their experience of mental health services is filtered by these different intersectionalities, right? And so I think that participatory processes, if they are inclusive, have to consider, right, how different identities interact with the participatory processes and what are the barriers. But also we don't want to create islands, then marginalized groups. We're really keen to bridge the gap, like to bring them at the center of the wider community, right? And so legislative theater is very powerful for that. But yeah, we can talk about that another time.
And also I think related with this is we should create a safer spaces to this kind of people can participate, no? Because they are not, it's not it's not a thing that they are acostumbrados to do this.
Yeah.
So we need to create this safe environment, no?
Yeah, but I think this environment already exists. They often have communities, groups they work with, and I think it's just about some level of arrogance that we create the space and we invite them to our space and then we expect them to feel safe. And instead what we want to do and inspire is around the spaces where this groups work and live, right? And so build on the action that they already do and sort of just create more space for them to build a collective actions within the group and across groups, right? But because of that, we really have to work closely with community groups and youth groups. They are part of and that support them. And that's why, like, whenever I do this engaged research, I really want to work with local grassroots groups, local community groups, because they really understand what is a safe space to them, which might be very different from me, and there might be a lot of things that I overlook and I don't consider, right? And so that's why we want to design these spaces from their perspectives, and then we will know that, it's their space, they have ownership, so they they will feel safe.
But we should force a little bit the idea of representativity to like to do like a compensatory representativity of this kind of groups. This idea of compensatory representativity, how does it work inside of the project?
I'm not sure if I understand this question. I think we need to explore it with, if you mean about oversampling.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, in the project, the center is on the groups that hardly ever the focus is on the groups that hardly ever participate. So it's not that we're inviting them to a space where they're gonna have, like, where they're gonna feel that they represent their group, and you have like one or two people from ethnic minority randomly selected as part of a wider. I don't think that works, and that's fair, right? And so yeah, it's a very different approach where we could design these spaces with these groups at the center, and then we invite the wider community to these spaces. So it's a very different approach, including the policymakers, right? So it's the other way around, yeah.
Because usually the participatory processes works like this, not like this micro representativity to have this kind of profiles. No?
And it feels a bit like tick boxing, right?
Exactly.
But here it's the other way around. So we're co-designing these spaces from the perspective of these groups that hardly ever participate, not because they don't want, but because they don't feel comfortable in the space that we design for, And then we're inviting the wider community. So, for instance, to engage with a legislative theatre play created by these diverse young people that I'll be working with, or to engage with a dance performance that brings into focus the rights of people with disabilities. So we're taking the opposite approach, right? So to really center their experience and then bring the wider community into these spaces, which I think by default are going to be more inclusive, because if they're inclusive for the people that struggle to participate, then they're just going to be inherently inclusive for everyone. But we will test and we will see how things develop, and yeah.
Super. Last question about Inspire. How do you expect about the impact of the project, the social impact of the project?
The ambition is that we will raise awareness, right, about the real weaknesses of the field so far. So it is overlooking the political economy of participation, or not really considering these spaces through an intersectional lens, or the fact that these processes are often ad hoc and not embedded. So I hope we will develop with the groups and the communities we work with a series of ideas, approach, suggestions, and then different community groups as well as policymakers and citizens can try and test and adapt to their context. So they're going to be live toolkits, right? And I think that the CDM platform is going to be crucial in as a hub for knowledge exchange and help us continue this work in the long term. But then policy impact obviously is in our mind. We want to focus on, bring attention to participatory scrutiny and participation as an ongoing process rather than an ad hoc event. It's an ambitious project. We have got 3 years to learn and share and develop. Then policy impact is always a bit of a question mark. So we're going to do our best by connecting with policymakers at different tiers and involving them in this process, also co-production throughout, to also understand feasibility challenges from their perspective in order to have this more participatory way of working. We can only do our best.
You will present in 2 weeks or 1 week your new book here in Barcelona.
Yeah, like the beginning of June. Yeah.
Weeks. And And as I understand, if I understand well, I can define in general the book like the influence of social movements in participatory policy making.
Yeah.
No? What do you think about the relation between social movements and institutions and public institutions? Do you think that works well? It can good dialogue? How which changes we need to create a more fruitful relation between them?
It is a difficult relationship, often based on contention, right? But it can also become sort of a relationship of productive disruption. Yeah. So I think there are some extremely good examples, like in Barcelona, with Barcelona en Comú. The book really explores different experiences of social movements reclaiming this space of participatory governance and toolbooks of deliberation and participation. And in the process, building some alliances sometimes with state institutions. And it works. Sometimes it doesn't work. There are a lot of challenges. I think state institutions and social movements are very different ways of organizing themselves and working, right? In Barcelona en Comú and part of the new municipalist wave, it was really interesting to see how these social movements effectively won elections, right? And then they started to really galvanize this participatory infrastructure, and it worked to a point. But then obviously the difficulty is also navigating all the regulatory framework, and there have been some really innovative experiments in policymaking, like public commons partnerships, right? That are still rethinking creatively existing rules about how to, transfer assets to the community, etc., etc. And but then there are also a lot of challenges, and I think there are barriers in terms of how the public administration works. So that's where it's fascinating, and I think social movements as well. There are a lot of activists. There are often volunteers. They want to see short-term impact because they're really affected by the issues, and sometimes the public administration and institution work much more slowly, and so there's like issues of frustration, right? And so like sometimes people just give up, and there are some chapters in the book that examine this relationship and these alliances from the perspective of activists, and all the frustration, and also keeping the community motivated when they don't see results. And it's complicated, but I think that's where the innovation happens. And I think there are that's as social movements reclaimed the participatory toolbox, they also shift the focus from just politics to the economy and society. And that's where democratization can really have an impact here. Because if you democratize the workplace, if you democratize the family or the school, that's where citizens really experience democracy or lack of democracy, right? And I think social movements have been much more ambitious in this project of more radical renewal. And so they've been using things like substitution or participatory budgeting, but with a very different focus, and inventing things like community wealth building, so that you link public procurement to cooperative and the local economy. So this is where real democratic innovation that can actually challenge the neoliberal economy can have input. But yeah, of course, it's there's a constant push and pull, right? And so there are some wins and then some losses, and then you have to recover, and then there are changes in government, and at least less sympathetic government might dampen down some of what has been achieved. So it's a continuing process. But then that's why I like assemblage as a frame. I'm not going to talk about it, but democracy is a continuous state of becoming, right? There's not an end point, and I think one of the risks of current praxis of which is really limited democracy, that they become so fixated with one specific format, like the citizen assembly, and that there is less space for actual democratic innovation. And so social movements have been much more effective at keeping the sort of the emphasis on the innovation as they respond to the real needs and problems that their communities face day by day. So yeah, so it'll be interesting to discuss, and then we'll see what readers think of this book. Was also interesting essays, but and there, it's not sort of rose tinted lens, you know. It's a book that is that really recognizes the challenges and reflects on the challenges as well.